You won't believe what happened when my best friend left me alone in his house with his mom. It started with a simple invitation to try their new sauna, but things got heated literally and figuratively. She walked in, her robe slipping just enough to catch my attention, and from that moment, everything changed. What went down in that steam-filled room was something I never saw coming, and it's something I'll never forget. Trust me, you're going to want to hear every detail of this one. The snowstorm was brutal, the kind that turned streets into ghostly wastelands and left your breath hanging in the freezing air. I had been trudging through the snow for what felt like hours, every step crunching against the icy ground. By the time I reached Jake's house, my face was numb, and my fingers tingled even inside my gloves. Jake's house stood like a beacon of warmth in the relentless winter night. Its windows glowed softly, a sharp contrast to the swirling white chaos outside. As I climbed the front steps, the wind howled through the trees behind me, and I could not wait to escape the cold. The door swung open before I even knocked, and there he was, Jake, grinning like he had been waiting all day to show me something. "Dude, you made it," he said, pulling me inside with a firm tug. The wave of heat that greeted me as I stepped into the foyer was nothing short of heavenly. "Barely," I said, shaking the snow off my boots. "I thought I was going to turn into an ice sculpture out there." Jake laughed, slapping me on the back. "Well, you picked the right night to come over. You are not going to believe what we got installed last week." He did not wait for me to guess. "A sauna," he said, his grin widening. "My dad has been raving about it non-stop. He says it is the perfect way to relax after a day like today. You have got to try it." The idea sounded perfect. A sauna? On a night this cold? "That sounds amazing," I admitted, finally starting to feel the warmth seep into my bones. Jake grabbed his coat off the rack, pulling it on hurriedly. "I knew you would be into it. But here is the thing, my dad asked me to grab a few things from the hardware store before they close. It will only take me a little while. My mom can show you how to use it in the meantime. She knows all the settings and stuff better than I do." I nodded, brushing off the idea as no big deal. Grace, his mom, had always been welcoming and kind whenever I visited. She had a knack for making guests feel at home, so I figured getting a quick sauna tutorial would be easy enough. Jake clapped me on the shoulder before heading out the door. "Go get warm," he called over his shoulder, disappearing into the swirling snow. I stood in the living room, soaking in the quiet comfort of the house. The snowfall outside had thickened, muffling the world beyond the windows. The faint hum of the heater blended with the occasional crack of wood settling in the fireplace. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Moments later, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps. Grace entered the room, her presence warm and casual. She was wearing a pale robe that tied at the waist, her dark hair loosely pinned up, a few stray strands framing her face. "Jake said you wanted to try the sauna," she said, her voice light and inviting. "Yeah," I replied with a nod. "He talked it up so much I figured I might as well." She chuckled, motioning for me to follow her down the hall. "Come on, I will get it ready for you." The sauna was tucked away in a private corner of the house, far from the rest of the rooms. The moment Grace opened the door, I was hit with a wave of heat. Inside, the wood-paneled walls glowed warmly, and the faint aroma of cedar filled the air. The stone heater in the corner radiated a steady, welcoming warmth. Grace stepped inside, showing me the controls on the wall. "You can adjust the temperature here," she said, her fingers brushing the dials. "And this is for adding water to the rocks, it makes the steam thicker. Do not add too much at once, or it gets overwhelming fast." I nodded, taking it all in. She moved with an easy confidence, her movements fluid and purposeful as she explained each part of the setup. "It can take a minute to get used to the heat," she added, glancing back at me. "But once you do, it is amazing. Just relax and let it work." Her tone was calm, almost hypnotic. I found myself watching her more than I should have, noticing details I had never focused on before, the curve of her neck, the way her hair caught the soft light. "You are all set," she said finally, stepping back toward the door. "I will be just down the hall if you need anything." She left me alone, and for a few moments, I just stood there, letting the warmth seep into my skin. I sat on the bench, leaning back as the heat began to work its magic. My muscles loosened, and the tension of the day melted away. But just as I started to drift into complete relaxation, the door creaked open again. "Everything all right?" Grace's voice cut through the stillness. I sat up slightly, surprised to see her standing in the doorway. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "It can feel a bit overwhelming at first," she said, sitting down on the bench across from me. "Sometimes it is easier to enjoy when someone else is here with you." Her robe shifted as she sat, the tie loosening slightly, exposing the delicate line of her collarbone. The steam blurred the space between us, and for a moment, the air felt impossibly thick. "You seem tense," she said, her voice soft, almost teasing. "It is all right to relax." She leaned forward, her hand brushing my arm lightly. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me. My mind raced, trying to decide whether to move, speak, or just stay frozen where I was. Her eyes lingered on mine, her gaze steady and deliberate. "It is warmer this way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The space between us felt electric, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. The air inside the sauna felt heavier now, the steam curling around us, making everything feel closer, more intimate. Grace's robe shifted as she leaned back against the wooden wall, her movements slow and deliberate. Her gaze lingered on mine, and I found myself unable to look away. "You like it, do you not?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with intent. I nodded, unsure of what to say. My mind was racing, but my body seemed rooted in place. The warmth that had been so relaxing moments ago now felt stifling, the tension between us hotter than the sauna itself. "You look like you have something on your mind," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Do not hold back. This is supposed to be a place to let go." Her words felt layered, as if they carried a meaning beyond the surface. She reached for the ladle beside her, pouring water over the hot stones. Steam hissed and rose around us, obscuring her features for a moment before settling into a hazy veil. "Relax," she said again, leaning slightly closer. "You seem like you need it." Her hand brushed against mine, light, almost accidental, but the touch sent a spark through me. I glanced at her, and the look in her eyes stopped me cold. It was not casual, not friendly. There was something else there, something I could not ignore. "Sometimes," she continued, her voice lower now, "you just need to share the heat with someone else." I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say or do. But before I could decide, she shifted closer, the tie of her robe loosening slightly. I caught a glimpse of her bare shoulder, damp with sweat, and felt my breath catch. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked, her tone soft but laced with a challenge. I hesitated. I should have said yes. I should have told her to go. But instead, I shook my head. "No," I said finally, my voice barely audible. Her smile deepened, and she leaned in, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Her touch was warm, gentle, and utterly disarming. I felt the last traces of resistance slipping away as she closed the gap between us. Her lips brushed against mine, tentative, testing, but the connection was immediate. The kiss deepened quickly, her hands sliding to my neck as she pulled me closer. I felt the heat of her body pressing against mine, her movements unhurried but deliberate. I reached for her waist, my fingers brushing the soft fabric of her robe before slipping beneath it. Her skin was warm, almost feverish, and the sensation sent a shiver through me despite the stifling heat of the sauna. She straddled me, her robe falling open as her body pressed against mine. My hands explored her back, tracing the curve of her spine, every touch drawing a soft sigh from her lips. Her hair, damp from the steam, clung to her neck as she tilted her head back, her breathing heavy. "You feel so good," she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her lips moved to my neck, trailing down to my collarbone, leaving a trail of heat in their wake. I let my hands wander, exploring the contours of her body, every inch more intoxicating than the last. The room seemed to spin, the heat and the intensity of the moment blurring everything else into oblivion. The sound of the steam hissing on the stones, the soft crackle of the wood, and the rhythm of our breathing became the only things I could hear. But just as I thought the moment would stretch on forever, the faint sound of a door slamming echoed from somewhere in the house. Grace froze, her body tensing against mine. Her eyes snapped open, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic cross her face. She slipped off me quickly, adjusting her robe with trembling hands. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice urgent but low. We both listened intently, the sound of footsteps moving through the house growing louder. My heart pounded in my chest, the rush of adrenaline crashing over me like a wave. The footsteps passed, fading into the distance. Grace exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "That was too close," she said, her tone more composed now. She glanced at me, her expression a mix of regret and something else, something unspoken but undeniable. "We need to stop," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. But as she moved to stand, I reached for her wrist, stopping her. "Do you want to stop?" I asked, my voice low but steady. She hesitated, her gaze locked on mine. For a moment, it felt like the world had paused, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. Then, slowly, a small smile crept across her lips. "Just one more time," she whispered, her tone soft but resolute. She lowered herself onto my lap again, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hands found their way to my chest, her fingers tracing the lines of my body as her lips found mine once more. The kiss was deeper this time, more urgent, more consuming. The heat of the sauna seemed to fade into the background as we lost ourselves in the moment. Her robe slipped from her shoulders, pooling around her waist as her body pressed against mine. Every touch, every kiss felt more intense, more deliberate, as if we were both trying to savor every second. The world outside the sauna faded completely, leaving only the two of us and the overwhelming need to be closer. The sauna's heat wrapped around us like a cocoon, isolating us from the rest of the world. Grace's robe had slipped off entirely now, her bare skin glistening with sweat in the dim light. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring every second. I let my hands roam her body, exploring every curve, every inch of her warmth. She leaned into me, her breath hot against my ear as her lips brushed my skin. "You feel incredible," she murmured, her voice low and filled with desire. Her hands moved down my chest, her touch igniting sparks wherever it lingered. She was in complete control, her confidence intoxicating, and I could not resist the pull of her presence. Every inch of her body against mine felt electric, and the line between right and wrong blurred further with every passing moment. Her lips trailed down my neck, and I tilted my head back, letting this sensation take over. My hands found her hips, pulling her closer, and the warmth of her skin against mine sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "Do you know how long I have wanted this?" she whispered, her voice a mix of urgency and restraint. I froze for a moment, her words slicing through the haze of desire like a blade. She pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting mine. They were filled with an intensity one had never seen before, raw, unguarded, and utterly disarming. "Grace," I began, my voice shaky. She placed a finger to my lips, silencing me. "Do not overthink it," she said softly. "Just feel it." She kissed me again, and any hesitation I had melted away under the weight of her touch. Her hand slid down my back, her nails lightly grazing my skin, sending shivers through me despite the overwhelming heat. I let myself get lost in her, the world outside the sauna disappearing entirely. Her body moved against mine with a rhythm that felt natural, like we had done this 100 times before. Her confidence only fueled my desire, and I found myself matching her intensity, meeting her every movement with my own. The sound of the steam hissing on the stones and the soft rustle of our bodies filled the air, creating a symphony that drowned out any lingering doubts. Her breathing grew heavier, her lips parting as she leaned her head back, exposing the curve of her neck. I kissed the sensitive skin there, drawing a soft gasp from her as her fingers tangled in my hair. "You drive me crazy," she murmured, her voice breathless and filled with emotion. Her words struck something deep within me, and I pulled her closer, wanting to lose myself in her completely. The heat of the sauna paled in comparison to the fire between us, and every touch, every kiss felt more intense, more consuming. But then, just as I thought the moment would stretch on forever, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the house. Grace stiffened in my arms, her head snapping toward the door. Panic flashed across her face, and she quickly slipped off my lap, grabbing her robe and wrapping it around herself. "Someone is home," she said in a hushed voice, her tone urgent. My heart raced as I struggled to process the sudden shift. The intimacy of the moment shattered, replaced by a rush of adrenaline and the cold grip of reality. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Grace adjusted her robe hastily, smoothing her hair as she opened the sauna door just a crack. She peeked out, her body tense, then quickly shut it again. "It is Jake," she whispered, turning back to me. "Stay quiet." The footsteps passed, fading into the distance. Grace exhaled deeply, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she leaned against the wall. "That was too close," she said, her voice shaky but composed. I sat there, still trying to catch my breath, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on me. My mind raced with 100 different thoughts, but none of them could erase what we had just done. Grace straightened up, her composure returning. "We need to stop," she said firmly, though her voice lacked conviction. I nodded, though the words felt hollow. Deep down, I knew stopping would not change what had already happened. She turned to leave, but I reached out, grabbing her wrist gently. "Grace," I said, my voice low but steady. She froze, her gaze dropping to where my hand held hers. Slowly, she turned back to me, her eyes meeting mine. For a moment, the air between us was thick with unspoken tension. "I cannot do this," she said finally, though her voice wavered. Her resolve cracked, and before I knew it, she was back on the bench beside me, her robe slipping open again as she leaned in. "Just one more time," she whispered, her lips brushing against mine. The moment Grace whispered, "just one more time," everything else fell away. It was as if her words granted permission to suspend reality, to ignore the storm of consequences waiting outside the sauna's steamy cocoon. Her robe slipped from her shoulders as she leaned into me, her lips finding mine with renewed intensity. Her hands moved with deliberate confidence, sliding down my chest, exploring every inch of me as if committing it to memory. My own hands found her waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between us. The sauna's heat was unbearable now, but it only amplified the electricity sparking between us. She straddled me again, her movements slow, deliberate, her skin damp with sweat that glistened in the soft, dim light. Her hair clung to her face and neck, framing her flushed cheeks. I could feel her heartbeat against mine, rapid and in sync, as if we were both caught in the same rhythm, unable to stop. "You drive me insane," she murmured against my ear, her breath hot and heavy. I responded with actions rather than words, my lips trailing down her neck, eliciting a soft gasp that made the air between us seem even thicker. Her fingers ran through my hair, her touch as intoxicating as the scent of cedarwood and steam enveloping us. Each movement felt deliberate, as though we both understood the gravity of what we were doing but could not resist. The sauna's wooden walls creaked faintly with the shifting heat, a subtle reminder of the world outside, one we had completely abandoned. "Do not stop," she whispered, her voice a mix of pleading and command. Her body pressed against mine, her hands gripping my shoulders as she arched into me. The world outside ceased to exist entirely. All that mattered was her, the way she felt, the way she moved, the way her every touch seemed to pull me deeper into a space I could not escape. But then, the sound of a door slamming jolted us both back to reality. "Mom?" Jake's voice echoed through the house, casual and cheerful, oblivious to the chaos unraveling in the sauna. Grace froze, her eyes wide with panic. She scrambled off me, grabbing her robe and wrapping it tightly around herself. Her breathing was ragged as she stood, her expression a mix of fear and regret. "We need to get out of here," she whispered urgently, adjusting her hair and smoothing her robe as she stepped toward the door. I stayed frozen on the bench, my mind racing. The intensity of what had just happened clashed violently with the sudden return of the outside world. "Jake cannot see us like this," she hissed, glancing back at me. "Get dressed." She opened the door slightly, peeking into the hallway. "It is clear," she said softly, stepping out into the cool air beyond. I followed her, the sudden temperature drop almost shocking after the suffocating heat of the sauna. My clothes clung to my damp skin as I hurried to dress, my hands trembling as the weight of everything sank in. Jake's footsteps approached from the other end of the hall. Grace turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Act normal," she whispered, her tone firm but quiet. A moment later, Jake appeared, a grin on his face. "There you are. Did you try the sauna? Pretty amazing, right?" I forced a smile, my heart pounding in my chest. Yeah, I said, my voice strained. It was unforgettable. Jake clapped me on the shoulder, completely oblivious. Told you. Nothing beats it on a night like this. Grace slipped past us, her movements calm and composed, as though nothing had happened. I was just showing him how everything works, she said casually, flashing a warm but practiced smile. Jake nodded, seemingly satisfied with her explanation. Thanks, Mom, he said, turning his attention back to me. As Jake chatted away, I could barely focus on his words. My mind was a whirlwind of guilt, adrenaline, and something else I could not quite name. I stole a glance toward Grace as she disappeared into the kitchen, her figure retreating gracefully, as though the storm between us had never existed. But deep down, I knew the truth. What had happened in that sauna would not stay there, it had changed everything.